and this notion that power is sanctified in Russia it's hurting relations between the federal center and the regions in Russia. Basically, Putin's power vertical itself is suffering from this, because in a lot of ways Putin didn't want to take responsibility for the difficult decisions that he threw the responsibility onto the governors, which kind of gave the governors a degree of autonomy, and then Putin tried to pull it back, and it's kind of creating this very tricky dynamic between the federal center and the regions. You also see a resurgence in anti-Muscovite sentiment right now in Russia. I did an article on this last week where, anybody that, spent any time in the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation knows that anti-Muscovite sentiment is never very far from the surface in Russia's regions. But the COVID crisis is giving it this really sharp and nasty edge. For example, I mean, you're seeing this impression because the first outbreak was in Moscow, which is natural. The first outbreak in any country is going to be in a large metropolitan area, just like it was in New York here in the United States. But this is not just a New York problem here in the United States. Same thing in Russia. The first big outbreak, of course, was in Moscow. And there was this impression in the regions that it was Muscovites that were bringing this to us. So there were calls to not rent flats to Muscovites in the regions, not let Muscovites go to Easter services in Yaroslavl, for example. You even had you had calls on social media for Muscovites to be burned at the stake, causing regional governors to come out and say, no, this is actually, regional governors had to say, no, we should not burn Muscovites at the stake. So you're seeing this kind of dynamic. So Russia's not doing a good job at this. But then if you look farther afield, the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil is doing an awful job to the point where he might be impeached. Right? In Brazil, Modi is not. I was listening to a podcast the other night about how different countries are handling COVID, and apparently Modi is not doing a very good job in India. So I think when the history of this is written, your democratic countries like Germany, and it's going to kind of give a boost to these boring establishment democratic countries that are just very good and very competent at things like this. Germany, New Zealand, South Korea are doing things right, and the authoritarian regimes are really not doing things right. And I think that when the history of this is written is what's going to come through. And my hope, and maybe this is my naive hope as a deep in my heart Democrat, that I think this is going to give credence to the fact that the democratic form of governance is indeed a better form of governance, and this crisis is illustrating why that is. That said, that some democratic countries could have done a much better job, and I hope we'll have a full accounting of that. This is part of our democratic process, to be transparent and have accountability. And I trust and believe and certainly hope, but I also trust and believe that we will have this. And at the end of the day, this is going to kind of raise the stock of greater transparency in regimes. And it's going to hurt regimes like Putin's that rely on smoke and mirrors. They rely on propaganda. And you can't bribe a virus, right? You can't bully a virus. You can't intimidate a virus. You can't gaslight a virus. You can't do a program on NTV or Первый Canal and it's going to make the virus go away. You can't beat a virus with riot police and put it in prison. So they're kind of faced with something they can't intimidate, they can't bully, and they can't spin away. And this is where countries like Germany and their form of governance is shining through. So that's how I would address that.
Yes, when the authoritarians are not handling something right, objectively, if I can say so, then their favorite method is denial and also the conspiracy theories.
Yes, yes.
And, what we are hearing now, these theories that are coming out now are just so crazy that it's even hard to comment on that. The theories
Right.
about 5G, about the Bill Gates, that he has the vaccine, about that Americans had something to do with the creation of this virus, and so on and so on. And if the authoritarians see that that's the only way they have got, with their total control on the domestic mass media and their spin machine abroad, won't they try to sort of focus on disinformation and propaganda as their only sort of viable response to the crisis? Because at the end of the day, it's not going to devastate the countries, right? You know, this is going to hit hard, but most of the countries will probably survive.
No, of course they're going to do this. And I'm still watching this and I haven't come to any definitive conclusions yet, but my early hypothesis about this is that what we're seeing in a lot of places is it's almost like muscle memory. It's like legacy disinfo. You see the troll farm, like the Internet Research Agency and others, putting out this stuff that is, let's face it, it's old propaganda memes, such as the nonsense surrounding the Lugar Center in Georgia, that there was a Russian meme going out there that this was where the virus was created and it was an American biological weapon. I mean, that I don't think in a real crisis, this is going to get any traction, quite frankly. You're going to have your portions of it, your small chunks of every population that's going to believe this. But I think everybody realizes that we are in a global medical crisis and that these kind of things, I think, are just less effective in this time. There's going to be attempts to muddy the water. And I see situations where Russia and China are trying to advance their own interests within the context of the crisis. For example, Putin last week was calling for unity among the former Soviet republics to fight the pandemic. And then, so you're going to see kind of Russia trying to get things they've always wanted, using the crisis as cover. I had an article out a couple of weeks ago about how Russia is using the crisis to try to get sanctions lifted. Now they're using a very old argument that they've always used in this kind of global pandemic. We can't have these sanctions. We need to work together against the common threat. They made the same argument about terrorism. It didn't wash with terrorism. The other argument they're making is that the West is being very inhumane by sanctioning poor Russia and poor Iran and poor Venezuela and poor Syria in this times of this crisis. So you're seeing an effort to do that. That could get some traction. I could see that gaining traction right now. And I think there's a risk of that. I also see efforts. I have a piece coming out later today looking at how China is actually worried about calls for more investigations into its handling of the crisis in the early days. The lack of transparency, the secrecy, the not sharing of information, particularly in Wuhan, I think really cost the world a lot. And I do think China should be held accountable for that. Now, this needs to be separated from some of the crazier conspiracy theories that have been discredited by scientists that the coronavirus was a man-made bioweapon. This is one part of this that I think we should dismiss. But this is very separate from arguing that China should be held to account. There should be an international investigation, because I think we all really need to learn lessons from this, from the future. We need to learn the correct lessons. And we have to, work with China to basically investigate what happened. And I think China should be called to account, as everybody should. But what's happening now is that China's resistant to this, of course, and they've enlisted Russia to basically push back against this. There was some stuff on Russian social media and in the Russian media about this. That they've basically enlisted Russia. Russia is kind of raising the specter of a new Cold War between China and the United States that can escalate into a nuclear war. This is the fear tactic you're seeing in the Russian media about this. You're also seeing efforts to conflate the kind of crazy calls, the kind of crazy conspiracy theories about, the accusing China of creating a bioweapon, with the more legitimate and measured calls to effectively call China to account and learn the lessons from this. But Russia is very effectively pushing back on this. In the domestic Russian media, there was an article in Izvestia about this. There was an article in MK about this past week, saying this is dangerous and could lead to a Cold War. In their foreign media outlets, in their international media outlets like RT and Sputnik, they're effectively trying to isolate the United States from the rest of the world. So if you see calls for kind of an investigation into China's early handling of the virus, you'll see like Australia calling for an international investigation. You'll see calls in Germany, like the tabloid Bild is calling for China to pay reparations for damages to Germany from this. And I think you're going to see increasing call for reparations on this. But what the Russian international media is doing is they're focusing almost exclusively on the Americans, trying to isolate that those crazy Americans are starting a new Cold War with China, and this is so dangerous. So I think you're seeing things like that come out, and I actually take that a lot more seriously than these crazy conspiracy theories that the United States created COVID in the Lugar Center in Georgia as a bioweapon, or that Bill Gates invented the coronavirus in order to make a profit on the vaccine, which is, what could be more absurd? I don't think any private citizen has done more than Bill Gates to try to find a virus and help the world right now. I think we need more billionaires like Bill Gates out there, and I think people are seeing that more. So I see this other form of disinfo much more insidious. You also see, Russia trying to consolidate its gains in the occupied territories in Georgia, for example, as this progresses. And how this is going to play out in the Donbass is anybody's guess right now. Because what you're seeing inside Russia now, last week, the prime minister, of course, was announced he had tested positive. So had one other minister, the construction minister, if I'm not mistaken, tested positive. You're also seeing widespread infections in Rosgvardia, in the National Guard, Putin's kind of personal Praetorian Guard. You're seeing mass infections within the Federalная Служба охраны, the State Protection Service, which is basically Putin's bodyguards. You're seeing thousands of cases in the Russian army. I don't know how much people followed this, but Russia finally canceled the May 9th celebrations, but the soldiers were preparing for that parade in very close quarters outside of Moscow, weren't socially distancing. And now you're seeing big outbreaks inside the Russian army. Well, conducting kinetic military operations and social distancing don't naturally mix together. And you have to wonder how this is going to play out in a lot of these not so frozen conflicts that Russia's engaged in right now. So how this plays out in the military sphere is still a very, very open question that I'm kind of tracking right now. And I'm trying to kind of have epistemological modesty, I guess, is the way, because we're really in an uncharted territory. And I'm trying to be very careful about saying unequivocal, definitive things right now as we are kind of working through this. But I'm looking at trend lines. And I'm seeing a lot of trend lines where this is harming Russia. And I also see Russia trying to exploit this. And I'm not going to be Pollyannish or naive about that. And anybody that knows me knows I'm not going to be, kind of soft and naive on Russia here. But I'm trying to we're really in uncharted territory. We don't know what the world after COVID is going to look like. God, here in America, we don't know what it's going to look. It's going to be a different America that emerges from this. And I think it would be kind of naive to say it's not going to be a different Russia that emerges from it. It's not necessarily a better Russia, not necessarily a less aggressive Russia, but a different Russia. And I think I'm trying to really be careful about following this. So I really think the jury is out. The jury is still out on how this plays out. I'm working on a larger research project now about alternative kind of post-COVID futures in Russia. I mean, it's because if you look at the trends inside Russia, it's not unambiguous that this is going to help the Putin regime. I mean, you're looking at, just let's take the fall in oil prices in isolation, right? You're seeing oil prices falling to levels we haven't seen in 2 decades or more. Now, Russia's economy is based on 2 pillars, oil and gas. And what happens when oil prices fall to this level? I mean, you saw Rosneft be forced to pull out of its investments in Venezuela, which were the main influence vector that Russia was using in Venezuela. I mean, the key figure in dealing with Venezuela was not Vladimir Putin, it was not Sergei Lavrov, it was not Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, it was Igor Sechin, the CEO of Rosneft. He was the point man on dealing with this. Now, is this going to cause a kind of decline in Russian influence in Venezuela? I don't know yet. We saw Russia forced to accept a very bad deal with OPEC on cutting production to prop up prices. And I mean, this was an utter disaster. Russia walked out of a deal with OPEC at Sechin's urging in early March, because although this would lower the oil price, Sechin thought that Russia could play a long game and undercut the US shale producers and effectively bankrupt them, and then go into a deal later. Well, when this didn't work out, Russia was forced to accept a much, much worse deal with OPEC right now. So what we're seeing is the decline in revenues as a result of oil prices. Now, Russia has reserves right now, but that money's not infinite. And if you look at kind of where money goes in Russia, it goes, I think, to 3 buckets of expenditures. Number 1 is feeding the kleptocracy. And this is essential for keeping the regime's internal legitimacy afloat. I mean, Putin has a social contract with the elite. You have license to steal as long as you're loyal. And so some money has to go to that. Some money has to go to the imperial projects of kind of putting the Russian Empire back together. Maintaining protectorates on Georgian, Moldovan, and Ukrainian territory is not cheap at the end of the day, nor are military adventures in Syria or Libya or elsewhere. So number 2, the second bucket of expenditures is imperialism, empire, and the third bucket is social welfare, right? Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist or a brain surgeon to figure out which one of those buckets are going to get cut. It's going to be the social welfare, and that's going to cause, at the end of the day, I think, social unrest. So I see COVID, and driving down oil prices as really, really harming one of the key pillars of the Russian regime. So I'm not entirely sure that this is not going to be very, very harmful to Putin. I'm not guaranteeing that it will be, and I'm not being Pollyannish or naive about the fact that Russia's going to use this crisis for things like sanctions relief. You're going to see a Chinese-Russian axis on disinfo. And the European Union External Action Unit, basically the foreign ministry of the EU, according to reporting from my old colleagues at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, that they see a coordinated campaign between Russia, China, and Iran. And this, I can speaks to this early kind of axis of sanctioned regimes trying to use the crisis to put out information that this is inhumane to have sanctions under these circumstances, and that we all need to unite to fight this common enemy, and therefore we can't have these sanctions, and let's just let bygones be bygones and let Russia do what it wants with these little countries on its periphery. We got a more serious battle to fight. This is the argument Moscow is basically trying to make. They made the same argument about terrorism. It didn't fly then. I don't think it's going to fly now, but I think we got to pay attention to it, because it's something that is going to catch on in some quarters in the North Atlantic community, in some quarters in Europe, and in some quarters of the United States, where people are itching for a reset, if you will. So that's kind of the kind of top line of how I kind of see the situation at the moment.
Oh, you mentioned the occupied territories, and just a few days ago, I think 3 or 4 days ago, I was very surprised to see that Russians went on with their borderization and creeping annexation. And also they held the military exercises, I think 2 weeks ago in both Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And I was very surprised to see that, because in times of such an epidemic, you basically don't want to put out your troops and your border guards to do the activities in which they expose themselves to the more danger of getting the virus. So I was thinking that it doesn't really sound logical, right, to have this annexation of military exercises right now. If you take it seriously, if you take the virus, the COVID seriously, and if you're trying to protect your soldiers and the population of the occupied areas. And actually there are, I think Georgian Ministry of Health, I think, reported that they have brought about 150 people from the occupied territories for treatment, because on the other side of the dividing line, I don't think they are offered any kind of treatment. I don't think there are any testing facilities. And by the way, you mentioned Lugar, and now Lugar is probably the sacrosanct place for Georgia, because everybody understands that Georgia's relative success is largely due to the Lugar lab, because Georgia was able to test basically anybody and get the results within hours. And this goes on. So Lugar played an incredible role here. While on the other hand, you see that South Ossetian response is amazing. They just don't take this seriously. They declare that nobody is sick, nobody has been killed, nobody has been taken to the hospital. But if you don't test the people, you obviously don't have the don't have the virus. But to the extent that you can comment, is there how this might affect these occupied territories, Abkhazia, South Ossetia? I mean, I understand this is a very, very sort of general and difficult question, because, as you said, nobody really knows what the post-COVID world will look like. But still, and Russia.
First, just on the Lugar lab, I mean, as an American citizen, I'm very proud that we got something like the Lugar lab in Germany.
Oh, yeah. We should be
legacy. And it has, in fact, helped Georgia in this. It also doesn't surprise me that the Russian propaganda memes are attacking the Lugar lab. They've been attacking it forever, saying it's a bioweapon. So I just don't see how they could resist using COVID. In terms of the occupied territories, I mean, it makes it more difficult on one hand, it makes it more difficult for Russia to conduct military style operations, because social distancing and military operations just don't mix. It also makes it difficult to defend against Russian military operations, because social distancing and defending against military operations, any military operation, defensive or offensive, doesn't mix well with social distancing. But on the other hand, and this is where it is cause for concern, the country that cares less about the well-being of their soldiers is going to be more willing to conduct military operations. And I think this is what we're seeing with Russia. I mean, Russia is going to care less about the well-being of its soldiers than Georgia, Ukraine, or Western countries. So I see an opportunity there in the short run for them, but in the long run, this is going to spread like wildfire through their ranks and deplete their manpower. I mean, you already had 1,500 Russian soldiers in quarantine as the result of training for the May 9th parade, according to reports in the Russian media. And so I think in the long run, you can only ignore this problem for so long, and you do so at your own peril. And I think this in the long run, in the short run, yeah, there might be some short-term gain, especially with the so-called borderization. And again, I have yet to see any definitive account of how this is affecting the front lines in Donbass, in the Donbass. But I don't see it in the long run helping them, because again, putting soldiers in close quarters is going to cause this disease to spread. It's going to cause this virus to spread. It's going to deplete your manpower and decrease your military effectiveness. And I just don't.
Hello?
Don't see any way of your soldiers being in close quarter.
We're talking about the short run and the long run consequences. What we see in the short run is that in most of the countries, the approval of the governments went up, which is natural in the times of crisis, because now it's a major pandemic and you have to rely on the government. What else? What else can you really rely on? What is the danger that the governments in Russia, but also in other countries, might use this to even further strengthen their authoritarian regime, or sort of shift to more dangerous mix of authoritarianism and populism that can be quite toxic. In the long run, yes, the social and economic costs will force the countries to readjust their strategies, But short run, really the flag type of thing, and then try to use this to further strengthen your own authority, not authority, but sort of further strengthen the society to keep yourself in power, basically, or to strengthen your power.
You're already seeing in Russia different aspects of this. I mean, for example, there was a law about putting out fake news about the coronavirus. Now, fake news is in the eye of the beholder, and those that have been prosecuted or harassed by the police over this have been people that have criticized the government's response. No great surprise there, right? A doctor who was criticizing the lack of equipment, personal protective equipment for Russian medical professionals was attacked under this, was harassed by the police and detained under the guise of this law. So you'll see very predictable things like that. Putting out disinfo about the coronavirus is a crime in Russia, and what the Russian state deems as disinfo is anything that criticizes the Russian state. So you're seeing that. That's one area where you're seeing the Putin regime try to use this. Another area is in the area of surveillance. Now in Moscow, Putin's kind of delegated to Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin the national response to this. And Sobyanin kind of road tested in Moscow this system of QR codes, that you had to have a QR code on your mobile phone in order to go out to request permission to go outside to conduct essential business, or to go to the store or the pharmacy or walk your dog or whatever. And this was described by some human rights activists as a digital gulag, effectively, that the regime would be able to use to gather more information on the population and on their movements and on their contacts. So there's that fear. Now that fear isn't unique to Russia, quite frankly. I mean, we're having a very lively, and I would argue healthy, debate here in the US about how tech can be helpful in kind of establishing contact tracing, which is an essential part of containing a pandemic. Google and Apple are kind of going in together on creating an app on this, but there, of course, are privacy concerns. What happens to that data? And what kind of sunset provisions are going to be in the law? Now, we're having debates like this in the US, which we are positively fanatical about our privacy and civil liberties here. So, and it doesn't surprise me that we're having this debate, but I think it's a healthy debate to have. You're not having that debate in Russia. You're having the rights activists getting justifiably very suspicious that the government is going to use tech to violate the privacy of individual liberties of citizens. But that is one way that this can be used. And quite frankly, the way that this was rolled out in Moscow was an unmitigated disaster. You had these long lines in the underpasses in the Moscow metro that were all over Russian social media because the police were reading the QR codes by hand. They weren't equipped to electronically read them. So it created this situation where Russian commuters were put in very close proximity to each other. It actually made the problem worse, right? So you're seeing kind of a blowback against that. And you're seeing a blowback in the regions about this, pushing back against introducing these QR codes in other regions. So I think any crisis like this, the gut instinct, the muscle memory of regimes like Putin's are going to tell them to use it to basically to exert greater control over your population. But in reality, I think at the end of the day, you have to deliver something with this. You have to start seeing the case numbers and death numbers decrease. You have to be able to flatten the curve in your country, which Russia is absolutely not doing right now. And that you can't hide that from the population. And so I think this is going to harm their legitimacy in the long run. Again, that said, they're going to attempt to use it in order to exert greater controls over the population, to violate civil liberties, to use it against the opposition. But I think that the game is changing in ways that I don't think they fully understand yet. I mean, let's face it, the game is changing in ways that we don't fully understand yet. So I certainly don't think they have any intellectual superpowers to understand how the game is changing in this way. I mean, I see different scenarios possibly coming out of this in Russia. I see a relatively but positive scenario in which what happens here is that this undermines the oil and gas lobby, forces the Russians to realize that their economy needs to be diversified away from hydrocarbons, which takes power away from the eager sections of the world and forces Russia to temporarily retrench on its imperial ambitions. And I stress the word temporarily, because we saw this movie before in the last oil glut in the 1980s and 90s, but that did not mean that Russia retrenched on its imperial ambitions. Look at when the conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Transnistria began. They began in the good old democratic days under Yeltsin, right? So I think you'll see that is one scenario though. I call it the new perestroika scenario. I think it's the least likely of the scenarios, but I think it's a scenario. I also see a scenario in which Russia takes, the Putin regime feels threatened with this and decides to go all out authoritarian. And that's the Andropov scenario, where you see the authoritarian tendencies in the society basically take over. And you see a move to a more North Korea style surveillance state and dictatorship. I could see that happening. The most likely scenario I call the Brezhnev scenario, and that's basically they're going to basically muddle through, and you're going to have a prolonged period of stagnation after this is over, with depleted revenues due to the oil glut. And I see that's how I see it playing out. But I do see, yes, Russia trying to use this to exert greater authoritarian control over the society, to violate civil liberties, to use it against political opponents. We see all of that, but we see it in kind of this strange mirror world where it's clear that they really don't fully understand this new world that they're dealing with. I'd really be interested in hearing what Arkady says about this when he joins us, because I'm imagining now the exchanges he and I could possibly be having at this moment, disagreeing and agreeing, two kind of old Russia watchers on this. But I hope that addressed your question, Shota. Those are some.
It does, but let me play devil's advocate here for a while. The pandemic is going to peak and then it's going to come down, even if governments mishandle them terribly. And then the governments, usually in the authoritarian countries, can easily claim that whatever happened, but they avoided the worst. And then, unfortunately, they can, point to countries like Italy, Spain, the US, and say, look, the disaster happened there, and compared to that, we are doing fine. And again, obviously, we don't know how many people will the COVID kill, but what the scenarios that we see, what happened in most of the countries where the peak has already passed is that, peak passed, and now both the hospitalizations, new cases, new deaths are going down. We see that, in Italy, France, Germany, Spain, and hopefully soon, I think in the US, it also started to go down. So why would people like Putin or other authoritarians not be able to claim victory?
Well, I think one thing is that you're going to see the cases go down, but also we're going to see them go back up, is what most epidemiologists are saying in the fall. But the scenario you just outlined is the scenario where I could see kind of a revival of this authoritarian model, where they could make this argument. Now, whether they'll be able to make it is another matter, because look, we've already lost more Americans in 2 months than we lost in the entire Vietnam War. And I was a little kid, but I know the effect that that war had on our society. Russia is clearly depressing its numbers. They're not fully reporting their numbers. That's clear. But how much you'll be able to claim this as a success, that's a very good question. If we assume, all right, we get through this crisis by the end of the year, and they're able to claim a success. We're not going to be out of this until we have a vaccine or an effective treatment. And we're not going to see that until into 21, 22, according to most estimates that I have seen. So I have a hard time envisioning a world in which we're out of this in the next couple of months. I mean, I would be delighted to see a world in which we are out of this in the next couple of months. I would love to go to a restaurant. I would love to go back to my office. But I also understand reality. And so I think the scenario you painted was one in which Russia could try to declare victory. But at the end of the day, I'm expecting this to be the largest Russian loss of life since the war in Afghanistan. And again, that had an effect on Russia and the whole former Soviet Union, for that remark. And when you have that kind of a death toll, I don't buy into this stereotype entirely that Russians just are much more cavalier with the loss of human life. I think that is often overstated, and I think that this kind of a death toll can't not have an effect in Russian society. And again, I'm speculating out loud right now. The fact of the matter is that we don't know. We're all going through something we've never gone through before. And this is a stress test for democratic societies, and it's a stress test for authoritarian societies. And so I think your devil's advocate scenario, sure, I could definitely see that one playing out. I can also see a scenario playing out that completely discredits these authoritarian and populist regimes. The most likely scenario, quite frankly, I think, is the muddling through scenario. That things kind of that you have kind of this long period of stagnation. Now, something to really watch right now is Belarus, because they are just pretending that this is not an issue, that the regime is, that this can be solved with vodka in the banya, right? And you're going to have a devastating toll there in Belarus. And the effect that this is going to have on that society is something that's going to be very interesting to watch. This is not just a stress test. This is going to test, and I said earlier, the virus doesn't care about propaganda. You can't bully or bribe or gaslight a virus. That's true. But you can bully, bribe, and gaslight your populations in the aftermath of a virus. And we're going to see the extent to which that they're willing to be bullied, bribed, and gaslit at the end of this. And I think that's still a very, very, very open question. This is actually helpful for me because I'm like doing my research for my scenarios of post-COVID Russia right now. And this is an interesting kind of thought experiment, and this is a good intellectual workout for me as I kind of think this through. The relative likelihood of the different scenarios and what will lead to each scenario. Because again, we really need to have epistemological modesty about this. The fact of the matter is we really are all operating in uncharted territory right now. Everything we're looking at is changing before our eyes in this through the lens of this unprecedented global pandemic. I mean, we haven't had something like this since the 1918 influenza epidemic, and that was a much less globalized world than the one we have today. And, you know, there are a lot of historians that actually think that influenced the outcome of World War I. So I think that this is something I'm sorry for not giving such a definitive answer right now. I'm a little shy about giving real definitive answers about where I see this. I'm looking at it in terms of probabilities more than anything.
Well, yeah, you are absolutely right. You know, we have not even a clue what the post-corona world is gonna look like. We don't know how long corona is gonna stay with us, and if it's gonna become a recurring thing that, you know, goes away but then comes back and it changes our lifestyle, for forever. But now the role model for the authoritarians of the world has become China.
Yeah.
Russia is no longer for quite a long
Yeah.
time, and globally Russia is not even relevant to this crisis, right? In terms that nobody really, Russia is not even blamed for inventing the virus. So how does this crisis compromise the world's authoritarian chief, basically China and its leadership, and therefore the other authoritarians? Because China was the one who claimed victory. They apparently lowered their death figures because nobody really believes the figures that they produced.
No, I don't believe it.
But nobody believes outside China, right? Inside China, you know, who dares to doubt? So what's going to be? Let's focus a little bit on China. What's going to be effect on international standing and international prestige of China and Chinese leadership? Let's say so. But also domestically, is it going to weaken or strengthen the Chinese regime?
Well,
therefore provide the example for the other authoritarians? Because now they are all looking to China. You say that Russia is trying to protect China, Iran is trying, because they see it possibly as their role model.
I mean, you see a couple of things going on. And first of all, I would not write off what's going on inside of China. I was reading yesterday about how residents of Wuhan province are trying to call for accountability in terms of the secrecy and the lack of sharing of information and the lack of transparency that, quite frankly, cost lives in Wuhan province. And the Chinese authorities up until now have been known for their competence, you know, I mean, leaving all kind of moral issues aside. So I wouldn't write off what's going to happen inside of China. The other thing, there is a feeling that China is trying to emerge from this as the winner, is trying to leverage this to increase its geopolitical clout. But there's going to be also, just like I talked earlier with Russia, there's an increasing recognition in Western countries that we need to diversify our supply chains, that we're too dependent on China for production and for our supply chains. And I think you're going to see a move away from China in a diversification of supply chains. I mean, we're already talking here in the US about redirecting a lot of our supply chains to Mexico. And there's talk of India as an alternative to China. So I think that China, the monopoly China had, being the factory of the world, the monopoly it had on our supply chains, is one of the collateral damage of this crisis, is the world's growing realization that that is a security risk. Why can't we get enough personal protective equipment here in the United States? Why can't we get testing kits? I mean, this, you know, at one point I was just scratching my head saying, this is the United States of America. We can't produce masks. And of course we can produce masks. We have the know-how to produce masks, but we've just outsourced all that to different supply chains. Well, this is going to force a lot of that to come closer to home for the US. And we're going to see the same thing in Europe. And what that is going to do is undermine the Chinese economy in a very, very serious way. So I see this cutting different ways. China is certainly going to try to use this to say, look, we managed to handle this crisis to the extent that the West didn't. But you're also going to see the West diversify its supply chains away from China. And then the other thing we're looking at, again, that we can't discount are these calls for an investigation into this and for potential reparations about this. Because the fact of the matter is that if China was quicker off the mark, if information in Wuhan were not suppressed in the early days, and I don't even want to, I mean, there's all of this speculation about whether this escape from a Chinese lab that's near Wuhan that was studying, this is a different line of argument than that it was the crazy conspiracy theory that it was a Chinese biological weapon, but that it accidentally escaped from a lab that was studying this virus. To me, whether it's that or whether it was simply came out of a wet market in Wuhan is less relevant than the fact that after this virus had escaped in Wuhan, that the Chinese authorities, at least the local authorities in Wuhan, covered this up and suppressed it and cost the world crucial time. Because if you had quarantined Wuhan in the very, very early days, you would not have seen a global pandemic. You wouldn't. This is something that China's going to be called to account for, and not just by the United States. Again, Australia is calling for this. And you're seeing a very aggressive diplomatic pushback by China on this. There was a great piece in the New York Times about this a couple of days ago. But that the anger is palpable in many different quarters of the world. So again, whether this raises China's stock geopolitically, they're certainly trying to play that card right now. But I'm not certain they're going to be successful in the long run. They might be. But if you read the Russian press, they certainly are preparing for this eventuality. There is this, like, increasingly you're seeing references to this kind of new bipolar world of the United States and China, and where Russia fits into this. And the majority of them have it, of course, with China on this. Although I could see a world where Russia tries to leverage this to get what it wants from the West in its own backyard. For in other words, we'll side with you against China if you give us the former Soviet space. Now, I don't see the West agreeing to that. And it's certainly not ours to give. And I certainly would think that the Georgians and Ukrainians would have something to say about that, and would not go down themselves without a fight. But I could see Russia trying to cut that deal. Again, they've tried to cut it on terrorism. They're trying to cut it now in terms of fighting COVID. We need to unite to fight COVID. Let's forget about all these other silly little concerns you have about the sovereignty of our neighbors. And you might see it in the future with China. But I am not convinced, and a lot of it depends on what we in the West do, and what we in the transatlantic community and together with our partners do right now. Because I think you're going to see several trends when you come out of this. You're potentially going to see a weakened China as global supply chains diversify.
Okay, let me ask you on that one more question. Now, everybody is talking that we need to diversify away from China because it turns out that nobody can produce the personal protection equipment, and even the masks, the ventilators. Therefore, we need to bring back the production or buy things in other countries. But what if China is still able to produce these things cheaper than anybody else does? Then how you defend yourself from the Chinese trade, and then if you sort of just erect the physical barriers or the trade barriers, then maybe you are going the way down that just creates the bipolar world, whereas you have the China and its satellites just trading just within themselves and the rest of the world. And then sort of cutting off China economically or diversifying production away from China, which sounds so logical to so many people. Would not that sort of as an unforeseen consequence produce possible in this bipolar world? Again, I'm playing the devil's advocate here.
It's possible, but I think what we're gonna see in the West after this is an understanding that how we construct our supply chains, just like how we regulate our financial markets, is a subject of national security. I think this is exposing that. And I think we've had this kind of this gospel of free and open markets for decades now. But I could see us moving to a model of still free and open markets, but more similar to the free and open markets we had in the 50s and the 60s, where you had, national security exemptions. We had this institution called COCOM during the Cold War, Coordinating Committee for Export Controls, which forbid the buying and the selling of dual-use technology to the Soviet Union or its allies. Now, you may see things like this today. You certainly would not have had a supply chain running through a geopolitical adversary during the Cold War, right? Now, this does not mean cut off China entirely, but it means we can never put ourselves in a position where our supply chains are dependent upon a geopolitical rival, like this. So you'll see a diversification of the supply chains, I think, and that could weaken China in the long run because they're
that would weaken Russia too, because if now we are constructing the international economy based on the national security and cutting off or restricting the countries that might pose the danger for national security, then Russia is, whatever way you construct your blacklist, Russia is in that blacklist, right?
Yeah, no, and I don't know how this is going to play out. I'm kind of painting a scenario of where I would like to see this go in the West. I mean, I would like to see this bring the transatlantic community closer together and to come to an understanding is that what unites us are the rules we believe in and that we've chosen to live by, and that we need to firm up these rules and construct our international trade system so that it supports these rules and supports our security, and that outside players who want to benefit from our markets, I think, need to play by these rules. And so I think you're going to see a change in how we treat China as an international player. And I think the first manifestation of this, I would guess, would be a diversification of our supply chains. And I think we're going to need to have something on the order of Bretton Woods, after this is over, to really take a good hard look at the global trading system and how it works and the bottlenecks that can develop and the national security problems that can emanate from it. And I think this is something we really need to think about afterwards. But again, whether China emerges from this as a new superpower that's able to basically turn the world into a bipolar world, this depends on on choices we in the West make in the aftermath of this. And right now, I'd like to see a whole lot more transatlantic cooperation and coordination on this score at the moment.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask. To have any effective policy, whatever it is, towards China or even towards Russia, you need a strong transatlantic solidarity. What is this crisis doing to that solidarity? Because we have seen a lot of criticism of the EU, that EU basically was not visible during the pandemic, that the countries of the EU had to handle the crisis on their own, and the US was not even there to help. And this kind of messaging, this kind of PR is damaging not just to Euro-Atlantic solidarity, but inner European solidarity too. So can we expect that EU and the NATO come out of this crisis more unified or more divided?
I mean, again, this depends on us. I think the criticism of the EU is a bit overstated. I think the EU is very quietly doing things. It wasn't so good at the kind of PR operations like the Russians claiming they're giving humanitarian aid to Italy when in fact most of the aid was useless. When they claimed it was giving aid to the U.S. when it turned out it was like selling materials to the U.S. So I think the EU could have done a much better job on messaging, but from what I understand, the EU actually was doing a lot more than it was reputed to be doing. I think one of the things we are feeling is that, we do see the US kind of stepping back from its global leadership role on this. That is something that I sincerely hope is temporary and will be reversed, as do a lot of us here. I think given the kind of restrictions on travel, to be an Atlanticist right now means going that extra mile to make this work in creative ways. And we're certainly trying to do this by engaging our transatlantic partners in events like this, and we're certainly sponsoring a lot of things like this. But we all need to kind of redouble our efforts, because I think you're right. The transatlantic bond has suffered a little bit in this, and the lack of explicit U.S. leadership has been visible. And
what should be done to address this?
Excuse me?
What should be done to address this? Because I think this is one thing that urgently needs to be addressed. That world is not in chaos. That still there is something that we can all look at. Now people are more looking now to Germany or German example than in terms of fighting with the COVID than the American example. Now, as long as it's Germany, it is fine. But still, can Germany take the global leadership? Probably not. It cannot replace the US. So how can US credibility and the US leadership? What should be done to restore it?
Atlanticism isn't just about what presidents and prime ministers and governments do. Atlanticism, the transatlantic bond, is deep in it's a bond of values among peoples, right? And if certain governments on different sides of the Atlantic, for whatever reasons, are coming up short in this, there's nothing stopping us from keeping these transatlantic lines of communication open. And that means people like us in the think tank and policy communities. But it also means parliamentarians on both sides of the Atlantic. I think we really need to redouble our efforts to do this. We're doing a lot of webinars here at CEPA now with our European partners, with both people in government, in parliaments, or in the think tank community, discussing different aspects of the crisis and lessons learned. We're certainly paying attention to the lessons learned from our European partners' handling of this crisis, both on the good sides, for example, in Germany, and on the negative sides elsewhere. So I think a lot of best practices are going to come out of this that eventually are going to be translated to the policy community. So I think that's what we can do right now. If you have governments in NATO countries that aren't particularly Atlanticist at the moment, that is when civil society and those of us in the policy community need to pick up the slack. So I think that's more of this is what we need to be doing going forward. And I on the positive side, I see a lot of it happening. I think a lot of us have kind of adapted to this new world where, God, I miss Dulles Airport, and I even miss arriving in Tbilisi at 5 a.m, with jet lag after a double red eye and an 8-hour layover in Munich. I never thought I'd say I'd see the day when I miss that, but I can't do that now. And you can't get on a plane and fly to Washington now. And none of us can, we can't go to GlobeSec, and we can't go to the Warsaw Security Forum, and we can't go to the Leonard Mary Conference or the Riga Conference and go to all these places where we used to convene, where a really valuable kind of sharing of experiences and information was taking place that I think was part of the glue of the transatlantic community. Now we got to get creative. We got to do it virtually. We got to have these webinars to communicate with each other and to do both, private conversations and public events. And I think we need to kind of double down on stuff like this, because I think it's going to be the new normal for a while. And that in doing this, and we have to continue to engage with with governments in our own countries to try to move the needle. And I'm confident that the transatlantic bond is strong enough that it's going to survive this test. But this is a stress test for the transatlantic bond. Now, the good news coming out of this, I said it at the outset, and I'll say it again, is that the best examples of the examples of best practices in this come from democratic countries. It comes from Germany, it comes from South Korea, it comes from New Zealand, and we can learn a lot, especially those of us in democratic countries that made mistakes in this. I think we can really learn a lot from this and emerge from this stronger, but it depends on us. We got to get this right. It really depends on us.
Let me shift the focus a little bit. You mentioned the debate going on about the surveillance while protecting privacy. Now, the US is a country with strong democratic institutions, long traditions, independent branches of power, and not many countries are blessed with all of that. You have the authoritarian countries, but you have the hybrid regimes all around the world. The question is, how will COVID affect them? Will the surveillance become part of life in the countries which don't have as strong democratic traditions?
I think there's a serious risk of that. And by the hybrid regimes, are you including Georgia and Ukraine in that, or are you where are you putting?
No, yeah, it's a broad spectrum, right? You have more authoritarian, like Central Asian countries, or you have also in the hybrid spectrum, but on the freer side, such as Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and so on.
I mean, I think on the unfree side, I think the surveillance is going to become, unfortunately, a fact of life. I think on the freer side, again, this depends on you. This depends on Georgian civil society. I mean, we were witnessing this pushback from Georgian civil society again over the upcoming elections and what the composition of the parliament, how much of it would be first past the post and how much of it would be proportional representation. And we saw this drama playing out in Georgia in civil society, pushing back, I thought, rather effectively. Now this is throwing a whole new factor into this. And again, how this plays out in this it depends largely on civil society. I mean, I worry about privacy concerns in the US, but at the end of the day, I understand that the fact that we are so obsessive about our privacy is going to be a kind of check against this. And that you're going to have, I mean, I see right now a very constructive discussion about this. I mean, I think it's on Georgian civil society and, civil society and all of these hybrid regimes that are toward the free end of the spectrum, whether we're talking about Armenia or Georgia or Ukraine or Moldova. It's on civil society to be very vigilant about this and to push this debate about privacy. I mean, hell, we see it going on in Russia. We see Russian civil society activists pushing the concerns about the QR codes. I certainly think that Georgian and Ukrainian and civil society or Armenian or Moldovan is strong enough to push this. And I think you can make sufficient noise about this. I mean, the whole distancing thing on this makes it difficult. It makes it difficult to protest, but it makes it difficult to break up protests. And I think this is where you got to get really, really creative. I mean, I saw a very interesting socially distanced protest in front of the White House where medical workers were standing 6 feet apart, but there were a lot of them, 6 feet apart, protesting the lack of personal protective equipment. Now, that's a very effective protest. Now, can you imagine a protest like that on Rusteveli Avenue in front of the Georgian parliament, where people are separated 6 feet, several layers deep, 6 feet on all sides, all the way down Rusteveli. And think of the nightmare for the Georgian police if they wanted to break something like that up without violating social distancing measures. I mean, think about civil society needs to think really creatively in this. I mean, online protests are actually quite effective. The world is effectively going online. And so is dissent right now. So I think a lot of it, to answer, I mean, I don't have a definitive answer how it's going to work in these hybrid regimes, but the obvious answer is it really depends on you. It depends on civil society in these countries. And again, your friends in Europe and North America are going to be with you in this fight. So that's the kind of the best I can answer on that.
Yeah, well, I can imagine it's a very, very difficult question. But for now, it seems to me that you have a situation where you have a scared population and the government that is trying to present itself as the one who's fighting against the pandemia, and the opposition, civil society, as the ones who are standing in their way, not helping them in this fight. So again, we don't know what the long-term consequences.
Society to adhere to these social distancing rules and to be very vigilant about understanding that we're in a health epidemic, but then being creative about how you express your demands and complaints to the authorities in a responsible, creative way. And again, that demo I saw in front of the White House with the nurses, I thought was absolutely brilliant, because it was like, a in front of the White House, classic Washington American thing, but it was these nurses 6 feet apart being very, very vigilant about, and demonstrably showing that, yes, we understand this is a pandemic, but we still have our First Amendment rights to protest, and we're going to do so in accordance with social distancing guidelines. And I think that is effective. That was a very powerful image that the entire nation saw, that I thought was like stood in contrast to other protests, which are calling for states to reopen their economies sooner than the authorities in those states would like to, with people not wearing masks, not observing social distancing. And I think that hurt that cause, because the entire nation saw that too. And so I think, again, the way civil society acts in this situation is extremely important, and to push your demands and complaints to the authorities while at the same time showing demonstrably that you understand that we are in a public health emergency right now, and that you're going to observe this. So I think I remember in honor of the people that lost their eyes in the June 20th events in front of the parliament, people used to wear eye patches, and now they should be wearing masks as well. And this could also become the face of the Georgian protest can be this. So there are tools at the disposal of civil society that I think that can be utilized in this situation. I don't think it unambiguously helps those with authoritarian instincts. I think, again, the jury's out, and I think it's on us. And I think this can be, through all this tragedy and all this death and all of this maddening, living at home, staying at home all the time, I think at the end of this, we may just see a democratic revival if we play our cards right. I mean, I'm an optimist.
In some countries, like in the US, you can have nurses keeping social distance, demonstrating, and that gives out a very powerful message. In other countries, like in Russia, I think the 3 doctors had to, or fell out of the windows
out of the windows, yes.
Whatever happened, but
Yeah. But this is not going unnoticed in Russian society. And again, I've been kind of watching very closely Putin's rating, and I'm seeing it fall on every measure. And so I'm not going to predict.
Even now, sorry, Brian, to interrupt, but even now, in the sort of apex of the crisis, you see his rating falling.
Yeah, it's falling. It's falling, and even among pro-Kremlin pollsters like Vtsion, you're seeing it falling to the lowest level since before the annexation of Crimea. Now it's still in the 60s, But when you're measuring the approval of a leader like Putin, 60s isn't good enough. 60s is great for a leader in a democratic country. Now, mid to high 50s is great for a leader in a democratic country. Hell, you could even be like low 50s. But if you're going to rule like a dictator like that with a kind of sanctified regime like Putin's, you better be up in the 70s or 80s or you're in trouble. So this is continuing a trend that was existing before the crisis, but the crisis is exacerbated. And I think this is something we've been discussing in the Power Vertical podcast with my colleague Maria Snegovaya, who follows Russian public opinion polls closer than any human being I know on planet Earth. And yeah, we're seeing a very, very, very clear trend of Putin's ratings going down. And quite frankly, as I'm watching Putin, he does not appear to be his old cocky, confident self in this, because he knows what he's dealing with. He knows exactly what he was dealing with, and he understands that this is something that you cannot spin away, you cannot gaslight away, you cannot kind of bully away. This is a real crisis that I don't think they have any idea how to handle with it. So I think this is why he's given authority for this to Sobyanin. Let the mayor of Moscow handle it. I don't want to deal with this, right? Well, that's impacting his approval, and I'm not going to predict that the regime is about to fall, but it's taken a hit. It's taken a blow right now, and I'm not going to make any definitive statements about what this means in the long run, but it's a trend that is unmistakable that I'm noticing and I'm really tracking going forward. So I mean, you know me, Shota, I'm an optimist by nature. I always want to see the silver lining in everything. And I do think that through all of this, I think some good can come of it, because democratic countries are just better suited to dealing with crises like this, because they demand transparency and they demand accountability. And when you have these in democratic countries, you don't have it in authoritarian countries. I think we need to kind of come together in the transatlantic community around this principle. We've not seen this happen for a number of reasons, but I'm not ruling out and I'm not giving up hope that it will happen eventually.
As the crisis goes on, people are now more focused on the economic and social aspects of it than on the health and medical aspects. People are not listening that much to the scientists and doctors anymore. They are listening to the economists and politicians who are telling them when the countries can open up and when they can go back to work. And sort of this second phase of the crisis that's coming up, that's this economic downturn. I know you are not an economist, but what is your estimate? How serious and how long can this crisis be? Because it's clear that we are going to face the economic recession, if not worse. And what will be its sort of geopolitical effects? Again, I understand that that's far in the wild.
It's getting out of my area of expertise. I mean, but one thing is clear to me. I mean, we will not solve the economic crisis, and the economic crisis is serious and real. We're seeing where they're saying that when all is said and done, this is going to be the largest unemployment since the Great Depression in the United States. And I think the United States is not alone in this. You cannot solve the economic crisis until you solve the medical crisis, until you flatten the curve, until you've managed to.
How do you imagine solving the medical crisis? Just vaccine or drug that helps it, or learning to live with the virus because it's not going to go away?
I think the holy grail, of course, is a vaccine, but that could take years. Now, we're seeing a concerted effort to do this faster than ever right now. The most optimistic projection I saw is 18 months, right, for a vaccine. The second is an effective treatment. Remember, we never got a vaccine to HIV, but we got effective treatment, which is basically rendered HIV no longer a major problem in Western countries. So that's the holy grail. But short of that, you can do things like have been done in New Zealand, where you have transparency, widespread testing, contact tracing, protection of vulnerable groups, like elderly people, for example, and then you adjust your life and kind of retool the economy to this new reality. Now, there's going to be an adjustment in this, and it's going to have long-term economic effects, but they don't have to be long-term catastrophic economic effects, right? We're beginning to see kind of retailers like bricks and mortar retail stores in the United States begin to go out of business. J. Crew, yesterday, was the first major US retailer to declare bankruptcy. I don't see people going to bricks and mortar stores, traditional stores, to buy clothing in the near future. I just don't see it, right? We're going to be ordering stuff like that online, and everybody's ordering things. I'm still shopping for groceries in the grocery store right now, but I could see a world where I won't be. Right. So a lot of us are, I'm ordering a lot of, Uber Eats, DoorDash, and Grubhub right now, and getting my meals delivered. And we're getting into this interesting scenario where you're ordering a really nice meal that you would normally have in a nice restaurant and sharing it with a family member, over Zoom, right? So we're adjusting our lives. Now, I'm still doing the functional equivalent of eating out in a restaurant. I'm just not doing it the way I used to. So the economy is going to adjust to this. And right now we're in the turbulence of the shift. So again, I think we can adjust to this. And I think, when we have a vaccine and treatment, I think we can basically return to life like it was sort of before the coronavirus. I mean, I have not been in a restaurant since early March. It was probably my birthday, my 57th birthday on March 6th was the last time I was out in a restaurant and went out to a bar for a cocktail. God, I would love to do that again. I don't know how that's going to play out until we have a vaccine. I mean, when you have a vaccine, you basically can go back to how things were, but that's going to take years. So, I mean, I'm sorry if I'm not an economist, so it's really hard to kind of to game out a lot of this, but I think we will adapt. I think market economies are very good at adapting to new realities, and we are in the process of adapting to a new reality right now. And it's a reality that in the most optimistic scenarios is looking at 18 months. Because if we just try to reduce these social distancing measures, every medical expert says it's going to create another surge that's going to overwhelm our healthcare capacity again. So I think this is I think we have to be really, really careful. And the economic crisis will not be solved in full until we have addressed the medical crisis. That ranges from the extremely, positive scenario of a vaccine that's 18 months away to very effective widespread testing and contact tracing, protection of vulnerable groups, and then kind of smart policy to open up the economy in those new conditions, which I think we can do as soon as we get these measures in place. This is why we're beginning to see New Zealand slowly open up as it's kind of ended community spread there for the time being. Now, New Zealand's an island. It's a lot easier if you're an island, in Oceania than it is if you're a large country in the middle of Europe like Germany. Now, Germany's going forward with some trial and error. They've begun to reopen the economy, and then they're seeing a resurgence in cases, so they're kind of scaling back. And there's going to be a lot of trial and error going forward. But I think, from what I'm hearing from experts on this, because I am not an epidemiologist and don't pretend to be, and I'm not a infectious disease expert, but I listen to people who are. In fact, I'm spending a lot of time listening to medical podcasts right now to try to get an understanding.
If I may interrupt you for a second, because Arkady has joined us.
Oh, great.
Arkady, can you hear us?
Yes, come on, Gilbert.
Hey, Arkady.
Welcome. We have Brian Whitmore here, and great that you can you could make it. So
yes, I'm very sorry I was so late. Was writing about how dictators are using this.
Actually, that is exactly what I wanted to ask you about, and that's what we've been discussing with Brian. How is gonna world emerge from this? More authoritarian or more democratic? Or which part is gonna emerge more authoritarian and which part more democratic, if I can ask that?
You know, I think steering in the future is obviously is very hard because, well, it's impossible, in fact, because none of us have ever been in this situation, and it actually doesn't adhere to any previous precedent. It is completely new. It's not like a war. It's not like previous pandemics. There are so many social factors at play here. You know, everything is changing as we speak, and you know, it's unlike the Spanish flu. It's not a consequence of a war. What we do see is actually a very interesting phenomenon where governments around the world, both democratic and non-democratic, responding in a way, sort of trying to persuade their people to take measures rather than just imposing them flat on them. So, you know, in Europe, in America, the idea is that you have to persuade, you can't just order people to stay inside, they have to buy into it. Where there is a sense they won't buy into it, the governments are more hesitant. You know, there's been a lot of stories in the media about how this crisis is good for authoritarians or would-be authoritarians, how they would actually use it to impose new restrictions and then not lift them, and they would exert more power. And you know, usually the examples are, you know, either some African countries or in Europe, you know, Hungary and Orban. I'm less certain about it because if you look at the two men who certainly in Europe personify authoritarianism, Putin and Lukashenko, and even Erdogan to a certain point. I mean, what's striking about Putin's response is, and Lukashenko's response, is that they have not, in fact, chosen to impose lockdowns. And Putin tried to distance himself from the whole thing. Lukashenko is pretending it's not happening. This is not the action of strong men. I mean, Putin's actions even have been compared to Stalin's reaction in the first weeks of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, when Stalin disappeared from public view. Putin hasn't disappeared, but has been consciously trying to distance himself from the crisis. If you look at the ratings, what you see is that, and I think we'll agree that any leader, any politician, whether authoritarian or not, does require a certain amount of legitimacy, whether it's electoral legitimacy or it's popular legitimacy, whatever. But if you look at the ratings, that's very striking, is that while the ratings of governments in Europe, Merkel, Macron, Boris Johnson, is going up, Putin's ratings are going down. And the crisis actually is bad for, I would argue that the crises are bad for authoritarian regimes. First, because it throws into disarray their own agenda. I mean, authoritarians like to control the agenda, control the narrative. Suddenly, if you look at Russia, all the things that Putin had planned has gone to pot. The 9th of May parade is not happening. The vote on this, you know, the show of public approval of his constitutional change, you know, has been delayed. His rating is going down. This is not the situation he likes to be in. I don't know what's happening. I don't know enough about what's happening and get enough sense of what's happening in Georgia. There is another factor, which is because everybody feels scared, there is and because the doctors and national health services are on the front line, this creates a momentum for sort of building networks for horizontal mobilization, which again is bad for authoritarian leaders. It's interesting that if you look at, again, the Russian media as an example, and if you compare it to the coverage and attitude of the National Health Service in Europe, what you notice is that while there is this kind of, heroes, the doctors are heroes in the West. There are every Thursday in London, people come out of public outpouring of public support for the NHS. And in fact, the slogan adopted by the government is "Stay at home, save the NHS." What's interesting is in Russia, again, the media, the state media, is almost sort of trying to de-heroicize doctors, talk as little as possible about them, because there's only one man who can save the nation. But more importantly than that, they know they could be just, doctors can mobilize very easily as a social network, which is already happening, which is something that, for example, Navalny and his people are exploiting. They're the ones who are talking, collecting protective kits for doctors. They're the ones who are, trying to bring doctors, sort of mobilize them politically. So the horizontal sort of mobilization and building of social networks is bad for authoritarians too. That is not to say that the authoritarian regimes are going to collapse tomorrow. I think, what I think we are going to see is that as their legitimacy tumbles further down, in a way it is a kind of a Chernobyl moment. But they will respond not like Gorbachev had done in 1986 by opening up the country. They will respond by overcompensating with repressive measures. Whether this will work or not, we don't know. What the sort of level of endurance of this regime, we don't know. We don't know. But it is a crisis point for them. And as I said, I think it's so far, if you look at the figures and you look at the public opinion, it's been far better for democratic regimes and their consolidation of support, like in Britain, where the Conservative Party is really rallying, than for authoritarians.
And Brian, by the way, you can jump in at any moment. Arkady, that's what you said is what Brian has been saying, basically, that the democratic countries have handled so far crisis much better than the authoritarian ones have. But so far we are seeing mostly the health side of the crisis. What happens after we see more of an economic and social side of it? When the people who are locked down will just get hungry. They're scared enough, and now, but they still they are more scared than hungry. What when they are more hungry than scared?
Well, I think it's, again, talking about the part of the world that I cover, it's too early to say, because the lockdowns are not as severe in these countries as they are in democracies and in the West, for very simple reasons. Reason that countries like Belarus, countries like Ukraine, countries like Russia can't actually afford it. You need to be a pretty rich country to afford this sort of ceasing of economic activity for such a long time. So, in Russia, a lot of stuff carries on. A lot of stuff in Ukraine is either carrying on or starting to reopen. Obviously, everybody will come out a lot poorer of it. This will increase inequality everywhere. We're already seeing that. I think the impact will not be. I mean, if you talk about just economy, it's the thesis, the hypothesis, is that countries that have managed to preserve the structure of the economy and the labor force, Western countries will be able to rebound quite quickly once the economic activity restarts. In countries like Russia, interestingly, the economic packages are much smaller. Not just that, they're very skewed towards the state sector or public sector. There is very little money and very little support, if any, for private, particularly small and medium-sized private businesses. They've been left completely high and dry, which means that rebounding from the crisis will be a lot harder because they're the engine. I mean, in addition, and this is in addition to the oil price plummeting. So that's one sort of factor we can think about. The other one is a sort of socio-economic factor. What happens, which is bound to happen when countries start comparing themselves to neighbors and start comparing their governments. Even in Britain, there is a talk, how come the Germans have done so much better than Britain has? Now, imagine this kind of situation, again, in Russia, where Putin's been saying to everybody how great Russia is and how powerful it is, etc. Everybody knows the amount of money that private citizens and private businesses have been getting from the government in the West. There will be some questions asked, why we're not getting. The people will start comparing themselves to others. So I think that will be another important factor. But in terms of the macroeconomic impact, again, it's unclear how it's going to play out. Partly because life is cheaper in Russia and in Belarus, so keeping the economy going is more important than saving lives, and partly because, as I said, we don't know what how and when and to what extent the economies are going to rebound, and whether there will be a requirement for second lockdown. So I think it's, in terms of the economy, I think it's just far too early to say.
Brian, did you wanted to ask something?
I'm glad to see, Arkady, that we agree. I mean, I have been spending a lot of time talking about how authoritarian countries do not have as good a track record on this as the democratic countries, particularly Germany, New Zealand, and South Korea. We see a disaster in Belarus. You're right. I've been tracking how this has been going down in Russia, and it's pretty mind-blowing how bad they've been at this. But it also extends to Bolsonaro in Brazil has done an abysmal job on this. Modi in India has left a lot to be desired. And I think the silver lining when we finally come through this awful period we're in is that we could see kind of a democratic resurgence. This could be something that kind of reaffirms the viability and efficacy of the democratic model. I thought I was just an outlying optimist, but I'm glad to see that you see.
Well, I'm not sure, Brian, that we're going to. I mean, we will see a greater demand for state. There is no.
That's not mutually exclusive against.
That is not mutually exclusive. I mean, we will see more regulation. We will see more taxation. We will see more. In the West, certainly, we will see much more interventionist state. The question will be the one of efficiency, as you say. What a lot of regimes, and this is where hybrid regimes like Russia will differ, or Belarus, or even Georgia will differ from China, because it's the question of efficiency of dealing with it. I mean, China has been quite efficient in a way.
If you ignore the first month or so, yeah.
Yeah, but it's the question of efficiency rather than democracy. What will undermine regimes like Putin's regime is not that it's undemocratic, but it's that it's inefficient. that is just a different, I would suggest that's a different paradigm. It doesn't enhance democracy by itself. And if the authoritarian regime is efficient, then it will, as in China's case, will strengthen the advocacy and the reasons for, I mean, China is not going to become less autocratic, it will become more autocratic.
No, but I think one area where it does strengthen democratic regimes is it underscores the need for transparency. One reason Germany did so well is because they were so transparent from the get-go. And then they followed that up with extensive testing and surveillance and contact tracing. And this was very efficiently done. But to have that, the transparency was absolutely necessary. Where China, quite frankly, dropped the ball in a major way that had global repercussions was that they were not transparent in the beginning. And had they been transparent, this could have been nipped in the bud possibly. Imagine for a moment that China responded to this in the initial outbreak with the transparency of a Germany. We would not have a global pandemic right now. We probably, I don't know for sure, but we probably would not have a pandemic right now. And I think this underscores the importance of transparency. And I think when this is said and done, China's going to have a lot to answer for. And I mean, not for this stuff about whether the virus came from a lab. I'm talking about their transparency or lack thereof, withholding information and secrecy in the early stages of the outbreak, where this could have been stopped before it was unleashed upon the world. I think they're going to have to answer for that in the long run. And I think now, and I have a piece coming out today about how they've enlisted Russia's help in pushing back against this, and Russia's obliging with a pretty aggressive information campaign. But
if I may ask, how much do you think this pandemic will change the structure of global economy? We were talking about countries, especially the Western countries now, trying to diversify away from China and move their supply lines from there. Is it going to happen, or if China remains efficient and cheap producer, then nothing's going to change because the principles of liberal economy rely on buying basically from the most efficient and cheap producer?
It's a good question. Look, in the same, again, I can't give you a exhaustive and complete answer to that. But in the same way as the illness itself or the virus itself exacerbates whatever underlying condition you already have, we've also seen that it sort of enhances whatever problems countries have and whatever trends have been there before. It's not reversing, things. It's accelerating them. The U.S.-China trading war has been going on before the crisis. This is exacerbating it. So I expect that we will have more protectionism and that the trade conflicts will get sharper as we start coming out. And we're already in a way seeing this. I think it's also, in terms of the changes to some underlying trends, I think I wonder what this is going to do to the whole idea of consumer capitalism that we've been enjoying for the past 30 or more years. Because in a way, the problems started to show much earlier, well before this. You could say that and the social changes started to show earlier. You could say that the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 was already moving sort of things in the direction different from the one that the capitalism has been developing post the end of the Cold War. You could say that the climate change and the sort of mass social movements that it's triggered, like Extinction Rebellion and the drive for more socialism and demand for more left-wing ideas, was another one. And in a way, this will come on top of that. So I think what would be useful and interesting is actually to look at all the trends that have been already in place before the crisis and think about it as how this will accelerate them rather than how it will completely change the trend.
So those who are free might become more free, and those who are authoritarian might become more authoritarian. That's, I mean, but in the more free side, you still have this concern about, you know, the privacy, surveillance, more state intervention. But on the, what about on the other side? Brian was saying that now the Putin's, he was talking about different scenarios, and most likely scenario for him was that he could still muddle through. The regime, the other two were that regime might go the Gorbachev style perestroika, or the third was it might go much more repressive. Now you're suggesting that more likely, it is more likely that Russia will become more repressive as the.
Well, I wouldn't rule out either of the other two scenarios.
Yeah, no, you mentioned all three scenarios are yours.
I think that the chances of Putin, if Russia becomes more democratic, it's not because Putin is going to make it so.
Right.
I think the example of Gorbachev and perestroika is exactly the one, you know, what you fear sort of happens to you. I mean, he fears that, and he's not going to start going in the same direction because it's the one he's desperately trying to avoid. So I don't believe in him trying to liberalize things. I don't believe.
And I want to clarify in terms of like when I say the perestroika scenario, I don't necessarily mean that is a move toward more democracy. I see it more of a move toward temporarily scaling back Russia's imperial ambitions temporarily.
No, but you know, it's
diversifying the economy away from oil.
Right. I think it's putting the two sort of in reverse order. I think, you know, Russian imperial ambition was diminished by the domestic changes and by certain belief system and reluctance to use violence at home. I don't think Putin is worried about using violence at home. I don't think he is going to really scale down Russia's interference. It's not that costly. If anything, he would cite the fact that Russia has been under sanctions since 2014 as a good thing. You know, Russian economy has been self-isolating. Imagine if Russian companies have been leveraged financially, it would be much worse. I mean, if anything, you know, he'll say, look, this, what we built, you know, building Fortress Russia was the right thing to do. So I don't think it will reverse anything. I think what could happen is uncontrollable things, and that I don't rule out at all. You know, the discontent is building up. You know, in the regions, the anti-Moscow feelings will strengthen. The elites might start wavering. Clearly, you know, the Kremlin is nervous. Whether, you know, if your rating really keeps going down, you know, we are in a new situation where this argument of Putin is popular just doesn't stand because he's not. So the behavior of the elites can change. The consolidation points may emerge. We simply don't know. But the idea that they will scale things down, that they will open things up, that they will support, you know, diversification, the signs are simply not there. The signs are to the opposite. You know, they are not saving their economic base. They are not helping it. They are not preserving it because they decided it's not worth it. So I don't see that happening at all.
No, it's one of my three scenarios, but I'm not ruling out any of the above. I think the more likely scenario is Andropov-style scenario where we see Russia become more authoritarian, or a muddling through kind of long period of stagnation Brezhnev-style scenario. Those are the two more likely, but I wouldn't rule
I
out.
don't think that's likely either, because Brezhnev stagnation was supported by high oil prices. Andropov is a bit of a myth because we didn't have Russia didn't have it. Soviet Union didn't have a really Andropov period. He dropped dead after whatever, 10 months or 12 months or 16 months. It doesn't matter. It's kind of something that was in people's imagination that this
so
was.
You think it's unlikely it'll become more pluralistic, unlikely it'll become more authoritarian, and unlikely that it'll stay the same?
I think it will either become, my feeling is that it either will become much more repressive without being efficient, and will start getting violent at some stage, or it will start getting violent sort of earlier rather than later. I don't see, unfortunately, I don't see an orderly transition.
Nor do I.
Not really, no.
No, nor do I. I don't think we disagree there.
Let me intervene briefly. We have to finish quite soon because we have a curfew in Tbilisi, so I need to get home, not to get arrested. But I have a couple of questions from the audience. One question from Ms. Media Inashvili is: can the world come out from the crisis with the same profit, or maximum we can expect is just to return to the pre-pandemic position? In other words, can we learn from the COVID-19? Okay, so can we learn from the COVID-19, and what are the lessons to be learned, probably? And second question from Mr. Shota Utiashvili is: while President Putin is quite adept at orchestrating and masterminding crisis of his own, this one is not of his making. Does Putin have an answer to the crisis? And if he does not, what would be the cost? Could the fallout be the final straw which breaks the camel's back? Well, I guess you discussed that quite.
Yeah, we discussed that in a lot of depth. I'm not going to predict Putin's fall, but I think he's been severely damaged by this. I mean, you see it's clear in his ratings. The phrase you see repeated over and over and over again in a lot of the Russian media is that Putin's authority has been desanctified. And I think something like that is lethal because his legitimacy is based on this almost cultish idea that his power is sanctified. So I think the regime's taken a blow. Whether it's the final straw that breaks the camel's back, I'm not going to go there and predict the fall of this regime or its endurance. But the regime suffered for sure.
And so the second question was, what is, and I guess that's the final question, what are the lessons, what are the major lessons that we as the civilization, so to speak, can learn from this pandemic?
We need an early warning system on global pandemics. We need to diversify our supply chains. They're way too dependent on China right now, and I already see movement in that direction. You need transparency, maximum transparency in the early stages of this. I think we've all learned about the kind of textbook response to a pandemic before you have a virus or a treatment, and that is widespread testing and surveillance, contact tracing, and social distancing and protection of vulnerable populations. And I think we've all kind of learned this. 2 months ago, I didn't know that, but now I do. I think I think we will learn from this. But whether we'll be able to return to what the world looked like before COVID-19, hell, I would love to go to a baseball game, and I would love to, go to happy hour, and I'd love to eat in a restaurant, and whatever. But I don't see us doing that in the near.
And I'd just love to come to Tbilisi, please.
And I'd love to come to Tbilisi and see Shota in person rather than over a computer screen. But like I was saying earlier, God, I miss jet lag. I miss arriving in Tbilisi at 5 a.m. after 2 red eyes and an 8-hour layover in Munich. But you don't understand what you really miss until it's gone. I don't see us returning to the pre-COVID world until we have a vaccine. I just don't. I maybe others may disagree, but I have a hard time picturing it, really.
Arkady, can you hear us?
Yes.
Yeah. So what the lessons learned, or lessons that need to be learned?
I think the lessons are that we're a lot more vulnerable, and I hope the lessons is that we need to be spending much more. The lessons is that there is more value in science and public service and medicine than in tanks. I hope the lesson is that actually the threat is not the one of, although, obviously I should be careful what I'm saying. I hope the lesson is that people will start investing more in their healthcare systems rather than in their weapon system. That said, you're sitting in Tbilisi, which has repeatedly been under military attack from Russia. But still, I think the societies, the thinking will change. Look, the thinking will change. It has been changing. It will now change faster. And I think no government system can impose something against the general train of thought of a lot of people. And I think even in the regimes like Russia, they are populist and they will be driven to a degree by demand. And I think demand should be hopefully will be not for geopolitical research and all that rubbish, but for saving lives.
Well, thank you both very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And as you said, I hope the time will come soon when you both can come and visit.
We all can be in Tbilisi.
I look forward to that day.
Thank you, Brian.
I even look forward to the 8-hour layover.
Yeah, I better go and file my story before I get killed. All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.